Hey weirdos, so I'm EmmaAbe and this is EmmaAbe Books, and today I'm going to be doing a wrap-up for April. This month I read 16 books. It was a very successful reading month for me. If you found the thumbnail to be a little bit deceiving, that's because I read most of these books on audio and don't actually have physical copies. Let's just jump straight into the books. I'm not very good at pronouncing things, so I will be mispronouncing things. That is just part of life here on this channel, so I apologize. It is not meant to be offensive or anything. So let's get started. As usual, I go in the order in which I read them. So the first book I read is A Girl Stop Apologizing, A Shame-Free Plan for Embracing Your Goals by Rachel Hollis. Okay, normally I don't really read self-help books at all. I just decided to read this book because I'm attempting to read all of the books that won the Goodreads Choice Awards. So this one won the category for nonfiction. And in my video where I react to the winners, I will link that somewhere in the cards in the description, I was very hesitant to go into this book. I kept a very much open mind about most of the books that I would be reading for this, and I've enjoyed most of them so far. I just knew this one I wasn't really going to enjoy as much because I had watched some YouTube videos by fellow booktubers, which I will link those videos in the description. Most of them are from Savvy Reads, I believe it is. She broke down this book and another one of her books, so I'd watched that review before I had started reading it, so I did have that coloring going into it. I wasn't unbiased. I was very nervous because I just already knew I didn't really like Rachel, or she wouldn't be the right person to appeal to me personally. That's how I went into reading this, and I read it and I didn't like it. Oh my god. I think I'm gonna rate it a 2-star because I just didn't like it at all. So I think where the book falls apart for me is that she gives this advice, which is good advice, like generally, but then once she dives into examples, it just kind of starts falling apart because Rachel isn't relatable. At least in my opinion, she really isn't. You can say she started from the bottom, which she did. She didn't grow up wealthy or anything, but the thing is that she kind of neglected address. Maybe she addresses it in other books, but she married her husband at like 19 years old. She was very young when she married her husband, and her husband wasn't as wealthy as he would become, but he still was wealthy. He was also a lot older than her. In that way, she kind of got a lucky break because when she wanted to pursue her goals, she had someone who was able to financially support her when she fell or didn't succeed. When she talks about how, like, oh, you just gotta, ask for help and all of this other stuff, which is true, when she draws in anecdotes from her life, it's just like, well, not everyone is like you. Number one, not everyone has the resources that you do. That is frustrating, in my opinion. I don't want to get too far into my thoughts because I could rant about this for a very long time, but essentially when it comes to her examples, that's really where it falls apart. So she'll show her tendencies to be a little bit ableistic, especially when it comes to things like mental health. The way that she approaches it, it's all in her mind, or at least the way she describes it, as mind over matter. So if you just apply yourself to do this one thing, you can do it. But that's not always the case for people, and she completely dismisses people who might have anxiety or depression, things that would affect your motivation and ability to do certain things. Not that you can't be successful and also have those disabilities. I completely disagree with that, but her advice would be very belittling, I think. It felt like she was saying that if you aren't able to succeed, you're just not trying hard enough. And I don't really think that's healthy advice for someone with mental health issues. I don't really feel qualified to talk about the allegations. They're not really allegations. She does plagiarize, because I don't feel like I'm uniquely qualified at all. There are other videos out there on YouTube that go through her books and point out all the time she's plagiarized. I ranted to my mom a lot when I read this book. She was very double standard. Like, she had lots of double standards. So she talks a lot about mom guilt and like how you shouldn't guilt moms for doing the things they do in terms of raising their child. I'm not a mom. I can't speak to that, but I talked to my mom about it, who is a mom, and we both agree mom guilt is bullshit. So we agree with Rachel on that. But a couple of chapters later, she goes to shame her own mother for leaving an abusive relationship because they didn't have as much money as they did before. I just felt like it was very hypocritical for her to say don't shame moms and then shame her own mother. And that those sorts of issues come up a lot in that book. I will say this, Rachel is a very good writer, and she narrated the audiobook too. She did a really great job. She's a really good audiobook narrator. So if you want self-help books and you can just want to take in the general overarching things and just sort of disregard the details, I think it'd be a good book. But I just honestly, those details really got to me, and that's why I give it a 2-star. This next book is Dear Girls, Intimate Tales, Untold Secrets, and Advice for Living Your Best Life by Wong. I read this directly after reading Girl Stop Apologizing as a reward because I was so excited to read this book and I loved it. Spoilers. I loved it. Also read this because it won the humor category of the Goodreads Choice Awards. I was very excited to read this because it's Wong. I really like her as a comedian. She also narrates the audiobook and she just delivers it really well. I enjoyed it so much. I thought that there were just little moments that really spoke to her personality, and it was just such a touching book. She talks about things that I think should be talked about a little bit more in literature. That's not very... One of the things that she talks about very early on in the book, and I personally got very emotional over. She talks about her experience with her first pregnancy being a miscarriage. As someone who, in the future, I hope to have my own children, miscarriage is something that isn't inevitable, but is very probable. The statistics are about like 1 in 4 pregnancies. And it was just good for her to talk about her experience so that I know I'm not alone, because she also talks about how she felt so alone and she felt so blamed by other people around her for losing the baby, which was no fault of her own. You know, there's miscarriages happen, they just do. There's nothing you can do. Lots of people said really awful things to her that they should not have said. I just thought it was really awesome that she spent like a whole chapter talking about it. I would go from like laughing to crying in this book, and I really enjoyed it, so I think I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5. I will say the one thing that did bother, and it was really just one, was she made this like throwaway comment in the book. And it really was a throwaway comment. I could see how it could be hurtful. She talked about how she was dating this one guy and then later found out that he has DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, which is colloquially known as multiple personality disorder. And she said that she was happy that she wasn't with that guy anymore because he was crazy. It was just a throwaway comment, but I could see how if someone who had DID read that would be deeply hurt. It's very important to acknowledge that DID is formed from childhood trauma. So people with DID are deeply traumatized through no fault of their own. They are not crazy. I don't have DID, so I can't speak to the experience of DID. I will link some DID YouTubers in the description below, so if you want to learn more about DID and educate yourself, feel free to. Just because you have DID does not mean that you are crazy. It means that you are a survivor and that you are very strong. That's one negative thing about the book, but I personally was not going to let that throwaway comment ruin the whole enjoyment of the book for me personally. This next book I actually have a copy of, wow, and that's Steinbeck's The Pearl. I had been wanting to read this for a very long time, and I finally did. I really enjoyed it. I really liked how short it was. I honestly thought the ending was going to be a little bit more tragic. Thought it was a nice, interesting view about greed and what it can do, how it can tear you apart. It was really interesting to see the cost it took on the main character and the main character's family. This was based off of a Mexican folktale. I think I would give it about like a 4. I don't think it blew me away, but I do like John Steinbeck as a writer in general, and I'm very excited to get to some of his other works. I literally finished it like on a walk. The next book is The Last Wish by Audrey Kinski. This is the book that usually people recommend you read first when getting into the Witcher saga. I read this because I watched the TV show and I like the TV show on Netflix. And I understand people's gripes after reading the book, but I don't want to say I didn't enjoy it. I'm gonna give it a few more books before I put down the Witcher saga in general. This book is a collection of short stories, so it's not the actual saga yet, so that's why I think I'm going to give it at least the next book, which is another short story collection, and then the real first book. Just see Geralt of Rivia gallivanting around this world, and I thought that was interesting. And one thing I did like is that it took fairy tales, classic fairy tales that we know, like Snow White, and it gave them these really dark twists, which I really like. I really like twisted fairy tales in general, so that was like right up my alley. But the big thing that made me really uncomfortable was how just sort of callously and casually rape and sexual violence was just thrown around as a way to just add to a tragic backstory. You can think like what you want, but I swear to God, it was like every single short story, there would be one person who had like a sexual violence / rape story, and I did not like that. It just felt so shoehorned in and really unnecessary to tell the story and convey the tragedy of some of the characters. If I keep reading this book series, if that continues to be a trend, I'm gonna have to put it down. I think I'm gonna put it at 3.5, 4 stars. I'm not really sure. But I am still interested in finishing the TV show and seeing more of what that has to offer. This next one is If the Walls Could Talk, An Intimate History of the Home by Lucy Worsley. I read this because it got checked out to me by the library. The audiobook, this is my copy. I really enjoyed this. I thought that it was very informative, extremely well researched. The author really did her homework on this, and you can tell that it wasn't just someone who was just Googling things and then compiling it. She really spent her time, and she talks about it in the book too, what she did to research. It's not a large part of the book, but it would kind of be like, oh, when I'm describing a bed, it'd be like, oh, well, you really cannot sleep on your stomach on a rope bed because it doesn't work. Trust me, I've tried. She would actually go and learn how to make certain types of meals, and she would sleep on certain types of beds. She followed this one lady's like really strict rules about how to properly make your bed, and I just thought it was really interesting. I do want to say that the scope of this is very well defined. It really focuses on 4 rooms: the bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen, and the living room. And also it narrows it down to England. A lot of this wouldn't really apply to like the bedroom, the bathroom of other countries. And I think it would be interesting to see another book like this, but looking at a different country, a different continent, because the history of the home is something that is really interesting, and I kind of like learning about those little tiny things that you wouldn't really think about documenting. You just think about like, well, how did they do this, that, and the other thing? I think it's really cool to see insights into a different culture and almost a different world that you wouldn't really get without something like this. The way she writes it, it's very information heavy, but it's not bogged down by that information. She does a really good job of laying out what happens and keeping the pace going. So I think I'm going to give this about 4 out of 5 stars because I really enjoyed it. The next book I cannot talk about because it's still in the running for the BookTube Prize, so be excited for at the end of May / beginning of June to see my thoughts on the book. The next book I read was The Lost Hero by Riordan. I really enjoyed it. This is the follow-up series, sequel series to the Percy Jackson series, so it follows the same characters. You do have more characters. I really liked it. So you open up this book and Percy is missing. That's one of the things that we know relatively right away, like in the first couple of chapters. And Annabeth, because she's a good girlfriend, is extremely worried about him. But it really does not follow Annabeth. You follow these three other characters. I forget their names off the top of my head. We have Jason, and you have his two other companions. And something is weird about Jason, because he doesn't call Zeus Zeus, he calls Zeus Jupiter. And everyone's like, what the fuck, man? With this first book in particular, the villain reveal, obvious, especially if you know about Greek mythology, which I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I did have my stint in middle school where I researched it a lot. The plot twists just really didn't seem to be plot twisty enough for me personally, so that's why I think I'm gonna rate it still at a 4 out of 5, but I still really enjoyed it, and I'm excited to see where this goes, what new characters we meet. I'm excited to see Percy. It has to do more legwork, this book, because they're introducing this whole other aspect of the world. I don't know if that aspect was planned from the beginning of the Lightning Thief, because I think it could lead to some plot holes, especially if you reread a whole of the book. I still enjoyed it. This next one is also one that I cannot talk about because it is in the running for the BookTube Prize. The next book I read was Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wayne Jones. And I read this because I really like the film. I watched it with my friends in college. I will say that neither the film nor the book has any nostalgic hold on me. I did pick this up because I was talking with my friends who I watched the movie with, and they were hey, bragging about how they have the only copy from our local library. I'm gonna read the source material because I heard that it's a little bit different than the movie. I'm just gonna come right out and say it. I like the movie better just because I think the visuals in it really help bring the world to life in a way that is really hard to bring through with the book. This book is geared towards younger readers. I really liked the main character. I think she's full of spunk, and I really like her a lot as an old grandma. Yeah, I don't want to say I was bored through it, but it just I wasn't super interested in it, and I just felt like I was reading it to read it just to see what it was like, and I'm not sure if it's a series or not, but if it is, I don't really think I'm going to be continuing with the series. I could definitely see why this book would be a good book for children, because it's a cool world, it's an interesting world to frolic around in. But other than that, it was just it was fine, so I'm just gonna give it 3 stars. Okay. The next book I read was The Great Pretender, the Undercover Mission That Changed Our Understanding of Madness by Susanna Callahan. And I read this because it was in the rounds for the BookTube Prize, but it was eliminated in the first round. Okay, it was up against Yellow House, Me, Charged, See People, and I Like to Watch. I haven't read a lot of the books. I've read some, but not all of them. And I haven't read all of the ones that have passed, so I can't speak to that. I did like the book. The one thing I thought could be cut and edited a little bit, because I do think that needed a little bit of editing. I felt like it went places where it was just what? Why are you talking about this? And I do think that the title is a little bit misleading. Towards the later half of the book, she spends a lot of time about trying to figure out who this one person who participated in this mission, in this undercover mission, who that person was. And she doesn't figure out who it is. And it was why did you include this? I'm you just made me sit here, and I was listening to the audiobook for an hour, listening to you trying to figure out who it is. Why? You didn't give me any conclusive evidence or anything. It felt stupid, and it felt like that whole section could have been cut out and I would not lose anything. The things that I found were the most interesting were the discussions about the history of mental asylums and the work that went into showing how inhumane they are. I found that to be the most interesting parts of the books, and I didn't really care for much of her investigations, and I don't really feel like her personal experiences connected a lot. I don't think we needed to know that. I do think that the little bit at the beginning was relevant. I don't think she needed to talk more beyond that. I even think that bit in the beginning wasn't exactly necessary either, because I don't really care why you're writing this book. Just tell me about the history of mental illness and mental illness treatment in America and how that all changed, which is bonkers, by the way. The thought of a lobotomy just makes me shake, and I don't like it. People were so mistreated for so long, and they still are, which is something that she does touch on, which I like, which I felt like if you remove the part of you trying to figure out who this mystery person was, talk more about the current state, that would be more interesting, because she doesn't really talk a lot about how current mental asylums people are treated, or not even mental asylums, but how most of the time they're put in prison into the psych ward. And that really isn't explored a whole ton. It's talked about a little, but I wanted to see more. I'm waffling between a 3.5 and a 4 because I did think the bits about the history were really strong, but I also felt like that section just really irritated me, and it was completely unnecessary. So check my Goodreads to figure out what I rated it, I guess. Okay, the next book I read is The Son of Neptune by, again, Rick Riordan. This is the second book in the Heroes of Olympus series. Yes, I read 2 of them this month. I'm really enjoying it. I feel I really liked going back to Percy. I honestly had a harder time getting into this book, primarily because Percy wakes up and he's not in Camp Half-Blood. He's in this different camp. And trying to figure out how it was set up was a lot harder. And I really do admire the research that Rick Riordan puts into these books. I don't really know that much about Rome. Sorry. I found this one YouTube channel that I will link, and I forget what it's called. But it talks a lot about history, and there's lots of videos about Roman history. And I am so glad I've watched the videos about the Triumph, videos about the Planarium, all of these videos just on a whim one day because I found it and I was bored and I was like, oh, this looks interesting. Because I would not understand the references to things like the Planarium and the Roman Triumph in this book. He tries to explain it, but I think it's helpful to have that background knowledge. And the whole thing with the Senate, Rome is very confusing in general. It's a whole bit of complicated gross history. Greece is a whole, oh my god, other matter when it comes to complex history. I think Rick Riordan was able to skirt around a lot of those things when coming to writing the first series, because he doesn't base a lot of how the camp functions according to Greek people would govern themselves. I think largely because Greek is a bunch of city-states and they don't all govern themselves the same way. It wasn't that big of an issue, honestly, but it was just kind of what? Why are they, what is a triumph? What is, why are there all these rules? It just felt, it was very different from Camp Half-Blood, which I think was needed. I think it would have been lazy for him to just, make Camp Half-Blood 2.0, but he doesn't, which is good. Also, what I really like about this book series is I feel Rick Riordan is expanding of the different ways he can combine traditions. So, in The Lost Hero, you had someone who was half Cherokee, and it was really interesting. I can't speak to, representation, but it was just interesting how it talked about, the Cherokee have their own very unique spiritual beliefs, as does, every single culture on the planet. And it was really interesting to see how those beliefs interacted with the established system that we know of, the Great Gods. And a very similar thing happens in this specific book too. You just have someone who is of Chinese ancestry. That was really interesting to explore, and I wanted them to explore it more. I like that Rick Riordan is expanding and doing more explorations into how this setup system of the Greek gods would translate to different culture. This next book I read is 5 Feet Apart by Rachel Hollis. This was a really weird book to read during COVID. I read this, first of all, because it won the best YA fiction. It is very much a book written for like that age group. It follows in a lot of the, cyclic drama trope. A lot of that was started by John Green's Fault in Our Stars. It's weird because I don't have CF, so I can't speak to that experience. It just felt like CF was the gimmick. That in itself made me feel a little bit icky while reading it, but I pushed through that feeling. But also just in general, like, reading it during COVID was weird for me personally, because it just stirred up a bunch of like emotions that I'm currently going through within my personal life, dealing with not being able to be with someone or touch someone or be in the same room with someone that you care about, deeply care about. So I understood those feelings. Also the whole thing with like the masks and the 6 feet apart rule. We all feel that right now. One of my irritations in stories is where you have these two people and they've been talking to each other for about like a week or a couple of months. And all of a sudden they're like, I love you, I would die for you. What? I understand that I'm not necessarily a hormonal teenager anymore, but I'm 20. I did not really believe the romance was on the level that they were trying to pass it off as. It just bugged me. The guy has this very severe strand of CF, and that's really deadly. Things happen where she shouldn't be safe anymore. Just the way it's handled, it's very much like, oh, like, everything's, like, okay in the end. What? Like, what? If you wanted to go there, freaking go there. And it just didn't. And I felt like that was a little bit disappointing. Also, with the whole thing, the reason it's titled 5 Feet Apart is because she's just like, CF took so much from me, I'm going to take 1 foot back from it. Because they're supposed to stay 6 feet apart, but they only stay 5 feet apart. And I was like, you're just dumb. I was like, that's just dumb. So you're going to take back a foot from CF and CF is going to kill you. That personally just made me angry. They try to like justify it, but the justification just, there's no payoff and it doesn't really make sense. I think that if they just left it at the last chapter and didn't include the time jump in the very end, I would have liked it more. That time jump personally pissed me off. I was just like, fuck you. For that reason, I think it's gonna, for me, get a 3 stars because I did like it, and sometimes I just shut my brain off to really enjoy it, but I also don't really think it deserves 2 stars either, so. And this next one is also a book I cannot talk about because it's in the running for the BookTube Prize. I promise, we're getting to the end. The next book I can't tell you about because it's for the BookTube Prize. Okay, this next book I was really excited to read, and I was so glad I read it, and that is The Deep by River Solomon, David Diggs, and William Houston. I read this because I saw like someone else's video, something, and they had read this, and I was like, wait, this is a book? Because I had listened to the song The Deep, and I like the song. I think the whole idea is like really interesting. I listened to the song because I listened to This American Life because I'm a nerd. They had this whole episode about Afrofuturism, and I had never heard of Afrofuturism before because I'm dumb. I thought it was really interesting. They commissioned the song The Deep, which is based off of this like concept album thing. I don't really know what it is. Premise is that you have this underwater society that was started because of pregnant women on slave ships who were thrown overboard. And one of the interesting things is they choose one person to hold all the memories for the society. One thing I really liked is at the very end of the audiobook, they have an interview with David Diggs, who I really like from Hamilton fame. He played Lafayette in Jefferson. David Diggs is so good. Oh my god. And that interview, I'm not sure if it's in the books. If it's not in the book, I really hope that eventually they release it with it because it was really interesting because he was asked, like, now that the book's out, is this like the official canon for this world? Part of the beauty of this world that we've created or that we've drawn inspiration from is that it's like a game of telephone. You have this idea and then other artists can take this idea and expand upon it and change it and make it their own, and it's like this little like multi-universe thing, but all like coexisting at once. I love that. Like, why does there have to be a definitive canon? I think the science bits of it are a little bit, what? And don't really make sense, but if you just shut that part of your brain off and just kind of accept it, it works and it's a really good story. I'm just sitting over here, I'm like, that's not how evolution works, but it's fine. And yeah, it just is really good, and I'm so glad I read it. I think I'm gonna give this a 5 out of 5. I really enjoyed it. It's short too, you can easily burn through it. So that is it. That is it for this video. Tell me what you thought of the books I read this month. I've got a lot of books to read for May, so yay. But also, I'm gonna be in quarantine still until the end of May. So we're gonna get lots of reading done. Fun. And I need to go to bed. Good night. Okay, the last book that I read in April is 5 Days Gone, The Mystery of My Mother's Disappearance as a Child by Laura Cummings. I thought this was interesting. I liked it, but at the same time, it felt like, why do I care? I think that's a large part of my issues with memoirs in general. It talks about this woman's journey to figuring out what the frick happened to her mom when she disappeared, why she disappeared, what's the whole story. It's interesting that she does a little bit of contextualizing to what that meant in the larger scheme of things when it came to other people that were in a similar situation. But at the same time, I didn't really care to learn about her grandmother's and her great aunt's like history. I think that she is very glad that she wrote this book for her family, for her descendants, because I think they will greatly appreciate it. I have no vested interest. I didn't care to learn more about her father. It's like you need all of that filler and all of that like background information in order to have the payoff of the reveal make sense. It's already on the short side. I think the audiobook was, 5 hours long, and I thought that that was a little excessive in terms of the length. So that's how I felt about it. It personally makes sense to me why this was kicked out in round 1 of the BookTube Prize. I don't want to say I regret reading it, because I don't think I do. And the reason for the disappearance is interesting. It's really slow in the beginning and that picks up like in the second half. And I don't really know if you can possibly restructure it to make that work. And I was reading it on audiobook, so I don't really know if it has a family tree. But having a family tree would be nice. Because, like, she refers to people, like, by their first name, and I'm like, okay, wait, how are they related? But also it wasn't too bad family drama saga-y, if that makes any sense. Like, it keeps it very narrow in scope in terms of the amount of people that are put into play. Again, I'm between a 3 and a 4 on this one, too. But overall, very productive reading week. Month. Oh my god. They're all attached. Oh my god. Okay, never mind. Excuse me. I should get some water.